Freedom is not given, it is taken. And it is defended not with words but with will. That will lives in us. Let it burn. Let it guide us. Let it carry us forward. No matter the cost. Because only through sacrifice will Africa be truly free. My brothers and sisters, today I speak not only as a leader of a people struggling for dignity and freedom, but as a man flawed, questioning, seeking truth. And in this journey, I have often returned to the story of a man who walked this earth long before us. A man who wore no crown of gold, but bore a crown of thorns. A man who owned no palace, but gave comfort to the broken, the sick, the rejected. His name is Jesus. I do not speak to divide you by religion, or to claim any moral superiority. No, I speak of Jesus not as a figure of ritual, but as a symbol of resistance, of love in the face of hate, of courage before an empire, of sacrifice, not for power, but for the liberation of others. What made him dangerous to kings and rulers was not that he carried a sword, but that he spoke truth without fear. He sat with the poor. He challenged the merchants in the temple. He reminded the world that justice is not written in laws, but lived in how we treat the least among us. He did not kill to save. He died to save. And when I think of what we are trying to do here in our land, among our people, fighting not with hate but with vision, I see in him a mirror. I see in him a reminder that real leadership does not cling to titles or power, but walks with the people, bleeds with them, and sometimes dies for them. Some ask, can a soldier follow Jesus? I ask instead, can a leader ignore him? If he stood in our streets today, would he not feed our hungry? Would he not weep for our stolen children? Would he not speak boldly against those who exploit and enslave in suits and in silence? This is why when I speak of him, not as a distant deity, but as a comrade of the oppressed, eyes begin to water. Even hearts hardened by war begin to break. I saw it in Raymond Zondon's face. I saw a man confronted not by religion but by truth, by beauty, by a love so pure it demanded tears. Because that is what Jesus does. He breaks us. Then he rebuilds us not as conquerors but as servants, not as rulers, but as brothers and sisters. We do not need to raise crosses on every hill. But we must carry the cross of justice, of dignity, of compassion. That is the revolution he lived for. That is the revolution we must live for. Let the world hear us. We do not fight in hatred. We fight because love demands we stand like Jesus stood. Not above the people but with them. Always with them. Jesus was not just a man of prayer or a figure confined to the pages of religious texts. He was a revolutionary, one who stood against the forces of injustice with unwavering courage. When I speak of Jesus, I do not speak from the pulpit of religious doctrine. I speak of him as a symbol of resistance, a man who dared to confront the empire of his time, who challenged the corruption of the religious elites, who walked among the poor, the outcast, and the oppressed, and who refused to be silent in the face of hypocrisy and tyranny. Jesus was not accepted by the powerful. He was feared by them, not because he had armies or wealth, but because he had the one thing they could not control, truth. And with that truth, he exposed the rottenness at the heart of both empire and religion. He walked into the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers. He called out the hypocrisy of those who used faith to oppress others. He spoke with authority, but never with arrogance. He did not seek status or wealth. He sought justice, and for that they plotted to kill him. He never raised a sword, but he disrupted an entire system. He healed the sick not to impress crowds, but to restore dignity. He embraced the leper, the prostitute, the sinner. Though society had cast aside every act of love he performed was an act of defiance against a world built on exclusion and fear. His revolution was not one of blood, but of the heart and of conscience. And that is why his message outlived every empire that tried to crush it. When I look at our struggle today, our fight for liberation, dignity, and sovereignty, I see reflections of the same resistance. We are not fighting to become new oppressors. We are fighting to break the chains that have bound our people for too long. And we must do so with the same spirit Jesus carried, with truth as our weapon, with courage in our hearts, and with love for our people. Even when the world tells us to hate, Jesus did not die a comfortable death. He was executed like a criminal, abandoned by many, betrayed by one. And yet he forgave even in his final moments, nailed to a cross. He asked for mercy, forgiveness for those who killed him. What kind of man does that? A man who understood that real strength is found not in vengeance, but in the power to love beyond pain. This is the Jesus I speak of. The revolutionary, the truth-teller, the man who stood against empire with nothing but a heart full of love and a soul that would not be conquered. That is why his name still burns in the hearts of the oppressed. That is why even today when we speak of him not in ceremony, but in sincerity, tears fall, not out of weakness, but out of recognition, because his struggle is ours, and his victory is the path we must follow. Leadership is not about titles, power, or personal gain. It is about service, sacrifice, and standing with the people, especially in their most painful and desperate moments. When I speak of true leadership, I think of a man who had no wealth, no army, and no political office, yet changed the course of history. Jesus led not by commanding others to serve him, but by offering himself completely for others. He walked with the poor, the sick, the rejected. He did not ask for loyalty. He gave love. He did not demand obedience. He gave truth even when it was difficult, even when it would cost him his life. A true leader does not stand above the people. A true leader walks beside them, sharing in their suffering, listening to their cries, and carrying their burdens. This is what Jesus did. When others looked away from the broken and the forgotten, he saw them, touched them, healed them. He didn't offer shallow promises or slogans. He gave himself entirely without holding back. And that more than any miracle or sermon is what made his leadership so powerful. His life was not lived for himself. It was lived for those around him. He understood that to truly lead is to be willing to bleed, to carry the cross even when the world is watching and mocking. He didn't run when the pressure rose. He didn't save himself when he had the chance. He chose to suffer, to be humiliated, to die, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to carry the weight of others' pain. He believed that no one is free unless we are all free. And so he gave up everything so that others might have hope. In our world today, we have seen too many who call themselves leaders, but hide in comfort while their people starve, suffer, and die. That is not leadership. That is cowardice. Leadership is not measured by how high you stand, but by how low you are willing to kneel to lift others up. Jesus knelt to wash the feet of his followers. He broke bread with those who would betray him. And even in his final hours, he offered forgiveness instead of revenge. This is the example we must follow. Not only in words, but in action. If we truly love our people, we must be ready to suffer for them, to protect them, to speak for them when they have no voice, to stand firm when it would be easier to turn away. That is what leadership demands. Not applause, not comfort, but courage. And that courage is found in sacrifice. The kind of sacrifice that says, "Your life matters more than mine. Your dignity is worth my pain." That is the leadership Jesus lived. That is the leadership that changes nations. And that is the leadership we must embody if we are to build a future where all people can walk with their heads held high. The message of Jesus was never meant to be trapped in rituals, ceremonies, or religious performance. He did not come to build institutions of control or to enforce meaningless routines. He came to restore the human heart, to challenge the systems that dehumanize, and to remind us that faith without justice is empty. His words cut through the surface of tradition and reached deep into the soul. He constantly asked, "How do you treat the poor? Do you see the broken? Do you stand with the oppressed? Because if you do not, then all your prayers, all your rituals, all your fasting, they mean nothing." Jesus never rejected faith. What he rejected was the hypocrisy of those who pretended to be holy while ignoring the suffering around them. He challenged the priests and elders not because they believed in God, but because they used their position to protect power and ignore justice. They wore fine robes, recited long prayers, and enforced the law down to the letter. But they had no mercy, no compassion, no humanity, and Jesus called them out. He said clearly, "You clean the outside of the cup, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." That is not faith. That is corruption wrapped in religion. The heart of Jesus' message was never about appearing righteous. It was about doing what is right. Feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, healing the wounded, defending the weak. He didn't ask people how many times they prayed. He asked them how many times they loved. Because love is the law that gives meaning to every other law. Without love, ritual becomes nothing more than habit. It becomes a mask that hides injustice instead of a tool that inspires change. When we look at our societies today, we see the same danger. There are those who perform religion loudly but stay silent in the face of oppression. They preach from pulpit while the poor sleep in the streets. They build churches, mosques, and temples, but they do not build peace or dignity or hope. And yet they believe they are close to God. But how can you claim to love God whom you cannot see if you ignore your brother or sister whom you can see? Jesus warned us about this kind of spiritual blindness. He reminded us that on the day of judgment, the question will not be, "Did you follow every ritual, but did you feed me when I was hungry? Did you visit me when I was in prison? Did you clothe me when I was naked?" Because in the faces of the poor, the sick, the prisoner, he is present. That is where true faith lives. In action, in justice, in love. So let us not hide behind rituals. Let us not use religion to escape responsibility. If we want to honor Jesus, we must follow his example, not just in worship, but in life. Not in empty words, but in bold compassion. Because justice is the truest form of worship. And how we treat the least among us is the only ritual that will ever matter. Jesus never picked up a sword, yet he stood against the most powerful forces of his time. He never commanded armies, yet entire empires felt threatened by his presence. His strength was not found in violence or domination, but in moral courage. The courage to speak truth to power, to stand with the weak, and to love even those who sought to destroy him. This is a different kind of strength, one that does not make headlines or intimidate through fear, but one that leaves a lasting mark on hearts and societies. In a world that worships power and celebrates domination, the path of Jesus seems weak to some, but there is nothing weak about confronting injustice without hatred. There is nothing passive about choosing peace in the face of war. It takes far more strength to forgive than to retaliate. It takes real power to walk away from vengeance when you are strong enough to strike back. Jesus showed this strength every day. When others called for him to crush his enemies, he remained silent. When they spat on him, he did not return anger. When they nailed him to a cross, he asked for their forgiveness. This is not weakness. This is discipline. This is purpose. This is strength that does not break under pressure. The kind of strength that inspires change, that transforms lives, that builds movements not on fear, but on conviction. Jesus knew that violence may win a moment, but it never wins the soul. He was not interested in temporary victories. He was building something eternal, something rooted in love, justice, and the truth that every human life carries value. Many leaders throughout history have tried to conquer through bloodshed. But their empires fall, their legacies crumble. Jesus built no empire, claimed no land, and wore no crown. Yet his message lives on in every heart that refuses to hate, that chooses compassion over cruelty. That is the kind of power that cannot be silenced. That is the kind of power we must seek in our own lives and struggle. We are living in a time where violence is often seen as the only answer. But violence only feeds more violence. It destroys both the oppressor and the oppressed. Jesus showed us another way. Not a path of surrender, but a path of resistance rooted in dignity. When you know who you are, when you know your cause is just, you do not need to destroy others to prove your strength. You simply stand firm, even if it costs you everything. This is the legacy of Jesus, a warrior of peace, a fighter for justice, a leader who chose the cross over the sword. His strength came not from fear, but from faith, not from control, but from character. And if we are to truly follow in his footsteps, we must reject the lie that violence is strength. Real power is not about taking life. It is about giving it meaning. That is the strength that transforms the world. There is something in the story of Jesus that reaches into the deepest part of the human soul. It is not just a story of a man who lived long ago. It is the story of truth spoken without fear, love given without condition, and pain endured without hate. When people truly hear the story, not just as religion, but as raw human reality, it stirs something inside them that cannot be explained by logic or reason. It moves people to tears, not because it is sentimental, but because it is true in a way that few things are. The emotional power of Jesus' life comes from its honesty. He did not pretend to be perfect by human standards. He was vulnerable, rejected, betrayed. He wept. He felt sorrow. He cried out in agony. And yet through all of that, he never stopped loving. He never abandoned his mission. He never allowed bitterness to poison his heart. That kind of truth lived, not just spoken, has a way of breaking through even the hardest of hearts. It doesn't just inspire, it confronts. It demands a response. It forces you to look at yourself and ask, what do I stand for? That is why when someone like Raymond Zondon hears the story of Jesus, not as a distant religious figure, but as a living testimony of sacrificial love, he cannot hold back his emotions. A man who has seen war, betrayal, and the dark side of humanity, who perhaps thought his heart had been sealed shut by pain and power, finds himself exposed by a simple truth that love is more powerful than violence and that forgiveness is stronger than revenge. These are not easy truths to accept, especially for those who have lived by force. But they are truths that free the soul. The Spirit of Jesus does not enter with force. It enters like a whisper, like a mirror that shows us both our weakness and our worth. It reveals the gap between who we are and who we could be. And in that gap, many find themselves overwhelmed not by guilt, but by a sense of being seen, known, and still loved. That kind of love is rare. And when it touches someone, when it truly sinks in, it can shake the foundations of their life. That is why even the most hardened leaders, soldiers, and skeptics sometimes break down when faced with the life of Jesus. Because his truth is not cold or abstract. It is warm. It is alive. It is truth with tears in its eyes. It doesn't come to shame us, but to heal us. To awaken the part of us that still believes in good, in hope, in redemption. In a world that constantly lies, manipulates, and hides behind power, the emotional truth of Jesus shines like a light in darkness. It cuts through pride, fear, and pain. And when it touches a heart, any heart, it leaves something behind. Not just emotion, but a call to live differently, to love deeply, to be changed. Revolution is often seen as fire and fury, a storm of anger that rises against injustice, built on the pain of the oppressed and the failures of the powerful. But not all revolutions are born from hatred. Some are born from love, the kind of love that refuses to stand by while people suffer. That is the kind of revolution I speak of. That is the kind of revolution Jesus lived and died for. It was not a cry for vengeance, but a call to conscience. His revolution was not about taking power. It was about giving dignity. When Jesus walked among the poor, when he fed the hungry and healed the broken, he was waging a revolution, not one of swords or armies, but one of values. He didn't fight to overthrow Caesar with violence. He fought to overthrow cruelty with compassion. He confronted the systems of oppression by showing a better way, a way rooted in humility, truth, and justice. He didn't shame the sinner. He forgave them. He didn't crush his enemies. He prayed for them. This is not weakness. This is revolutionary love. In the same way, our struggle today must not be poisoned by the same hatred we seek to overcome. If we allow our fight for freedom to turn into a mirror of the very oppression we resist, then we have already lost. But if we root our revolution in love, love for our people, love for justice, love for a better future, then we are not just changing systems, we are changing hearts. Love is not soft, it is not blind. Love is fierce. It sees injustice and refuses to accept it. It pushes us to act, not out of rage, but out of responsibility. When I see a child go to bed hungry, I do not burn with hatred. I burn with love so strong it cannot stay silent. When I see our lands exploited, our people forgotten, our dignity stripped away, I do not want revenge. I want justice. Justice that restores, not just punishes. Justice that builds, not just breaks. Jesus showed us what that kind of justice looks like. It's the kind that lifts the fallen, not by shouting at them, but by reaching out a hand. It's the kind that confronts power not to destroy but to reveal. It's the kind that lays down its own life so that others might live free. That is the power of love in revolution. It demands more from us, not less. It calls us to be brave, not just in battle, but in mercy. This is the revolution I believe in. One that does not stop at changing leaders, but changes the soul of a nation. A revolution that doesn't just remove chains, but heals the wounds they left behind. That kind revolution is hard. It takes longer. It costs more, but it lasts because it is not built on hatred. It is built on the only thing strong enough to carry a people through suffering into true freedom.